Welcome to the Noon at Northside podcast with your host, Pastor Stephanie. Well, welcome back, everybody. So we are into the month of June. We're about halfway through 2023 already, which is crazy to think about. And we are into the second part of our discussion on the infamous lay theologian C.S. Lewis. Now, normally, this second podcast that we do on a topic, we feature a guest speaker. But today, I actually want to feature, instead of a guest speaker talking about C.S. Lewis, I want to feature another podcast that I recently was introduced to and listened to on C.S. Lewis. Now, as you might remember, last month we talked about C.S. Lewis, and we specifically talked about his book, The Problem of Pain. Now, I really love that book because it breaks down, the problem of pain in a way that makes it easy to understand and in a way that is factual. It brings up the arguments and lists the intellectual reasons why the arguments don't hold up, and really showcases that, Christianity is, as bestly understood, the solution to the problem of pain. And it's a really, really incredible read, and I highly recommend it because you will learn so much about why people use pain and suffering as their argument against God, when in fact it should be the argument for God. And a lot of that has to do with C.S. Lewis's connection between the problem of pain and the suffering of Jesus Christ. And as some of you might be aware, there is a historical, factual basis for unknowing that Jesus Christ existed. There is very little argument today that he did not exist as a man, at the very least. And C.S. Lewis, when he's intellectually, reasonably going through the problem of pain, he brings up that Christ's suffering is in fact the very foundation and understanding of the problem of pain and suffering and why it should be used to believe in God. And it's amazing, and you really need to read it to understand it because, I can't really explain all about C.S. Lewis, but when you read it, you really get an amazing understanding about it. Well, the podcast that I recently came across was given to me by one of the other staff members here at Elkhart Northside, who found it's called the C.S. Lewis podcast, funny enough, and it just is understanding all about who he was, and what he wrote, and why he wrote it. And this particular episode was on the problem of pain, and it featured another key world theologian called Alister McGrath. And Alister McGrath is one of the world's leading theologians today, who has a very similar background to C.S. Lewis himself, which is why he considers himself, or I would consider him, a C.S. Lewis expert. He's written books on understanding C.S. Lewis, knowing him, knowing his background and such like that. Both of them, Alister McGrath and C.S. Lewis, they're British. They both were professors at Oxford, and they both were atheists well into their life, and then didn't find, God and Christianity until later in life when they converted, but they began having that relationship with Christ. And you hear a lot about this in this particular podcast from McGrath himself, but I heard about McGrath in college when I went to Olivet Nazarene University. We used his book called Christianity: An Introduction in our fundamentals of Christianity. So he's a well-known theologian, and he has a lot to say about Christianity, similar to C.S. Lewis, as well as to say about C.S. Lewis. And one of the things he talks about in this podcast, which if you want to listen to it, which I highly recommend, it's called the C.S. Lewis Podcast. This is podcast number 8, C.S. Lewis and the Problem of Pain. You can find it on Spotify, just like you can find our podcasts. And I really highly recommend listening to it so you get an understanding of what I'm about to say. And that is that McGrath's understanding of the problem of pain is in comparison with another book that C.S. Lewis wrote called A Grief Observed. And the reason for this, that he really focuses on these two books, is that they talk about the same issue, but from two very different perspectives. And they both, in my opinion, are great for understanding this idea of the problem of pain and suffering and how we can use it to bridge gaps today, how we can use it to love people, love Jesus, and everything that we talked about last month. Now, we talked about last month, and I even just mentioned it, that the problem of pain, the book, is answering the problem of pain and suffering from an intellectual point of view, which is why I personally love it. Because sometimes we get so caught up in certain other elements of things that sometimes someone just needs, okay, here's my question. Can you give me a reasonable, logical explanation that helps me understand? And that's what the problem of pain does. And it's amazing. It's phenomenal. In comparison, however, C.S. Lewis also wrote a book several years later called A Grief Observed. And it's very different because unlike the problem of pain, it's not an intellectual book. It is an emotional book. And it is his story of how he personally has known grief and suffering and pain. And it talks mostly about the death of his wife and what it felt like to go through all of that. It's not something you often find C.S. Lewis writing. He was mostly an intellectual person because, he came to Christ in an intellectual way. But to read about his emotional understanding of pain is really what helps us understand the problem of pain. Recently, here at Northside, I preached a few times where we talked about bringing together the physical body, the spiritual body, the mental and emotional aspects of who we are in one unified answer to everything. We talked about how important it was to understand that as a person, we are all of those things combined, that they are intertwined in a way that just cannot be separated. And that's what McGrath has to say in this podcast, is that, we can't just read the problem of pain because it's purely intellectual. And pain is not intellectual. Pain is emotional. You cannot make an intellectual argument on pain without even unknowingly thinking about your own personal experiences with pain and suffering. That makes it an emotional understanding. That makes it so much more. And we talked a lot recently about that we sometimes in the church, we focus on one thing at a time. We focus on physical things like needs of people. Or we focus on the spiritual things like spiritual formation and disciplines. Or sometimes we focus just on mental aspects, when the truth is that God created us to be all of those things combined: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. And pain and suffering cannot simply be an intellectual discussion because it's always an issue of the heart. And it has to be experienced with, our experiences. It has to be understood from our understandings. Lewis accomplishes this by using both his books, The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed. And as much as I highly recommend reading The Problem of Pain, I also want, like Alistair McGrath, to encourage us to read A Grief Observed so we can get the intellectual side of why we are to believe in Christ when it comes to the problem of pain, why God is the solution to pain, but also to read A Grief Observed so we can make the connection emotionally to what Christ did for us on the cross. So that we can emotionally connect what we're called to what Christ did for us. You know, one of the things when I was listening to this podcast that came to my mind was the very first time I ever watched The Passion. Which, if you don't know what that is, which I don't, you should know what it is, but it's a Mel Gibson movie about Jesus' passion to the cross. And it is an epic telling and understanding of what Christ went through, to the point where when the first time I watched it, I was so distraught. I was in pain watching it. I was emotional. I was crying. I was hyperventilating. My body ached watching this, real life imagining of what happened with Jesus. It was an emotional connection to what God did, what Christ did for me. And to this day, whenever I mention Christ's suffering, Christ's death, Christ's resurrection, in my mind, I am brought back to that emotional understanding. My body remembers the emotion that I felt in that moment. And that's what I experience every time I even think about Christ's suffering. And that helps me understand the problem of pain. It helps me understand that all the pain in life, all the suffering that we go through, does in fact serve a purpose. Yes, it exists because sin exists in the world. And there are some pain and there is some suffering that doesn't make any sense. We ask these questions like, why do these horrible things happen to good people? Why is this person made to suffer? Why we ask God why he's not healing us, why he's allowing this to happen. And the truth is, it isn't God allowing any of it to happen. God made free will, and we chose to use it for the wrong reasons. We chose to sin against all the things that God did for us. We brought sin into the world. We continue to bring sin into the world, and that means pain and suffering is in the world. But that also reminds us about how loving God is, that he gave us the right to choose. And so we can choose him. And when we do choose him, it is all the more meaningful. See, the problem of pain and suffering is that we often take a human perspective on it, which is fine, but we also have to remember that we're also dealing with a loving God. And love is fundamental to life. Love is fundamental to creation. And the opposite to experiencing love is experiencing suffering and pain. And that's something you understand when you read C.S. Lewis' book, A Grief Observed. One of the things Alistair McGrath mentioned in the podcast on the problem of pain is he brought up a well-known quote. And I don't remember who said it, but it's a quote you've probably all heard of, that it is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And that is because God created love to be incredible. His creation came from love. And loving somebody, loving God, loving anything is worth this pain and suffering you go through as a result of sin in the world. God is good, and the one good thing that he made above all else was the free will we have. And unfortunately, that implies that there is a possibility for evil, a possibility for pain, and suffering. But the one thing to hold on to is the hope of love that comes despite it all. The one thing to hold on to is the hope of what God has for us in store. The hope of what Christ did to us and will bring us to. The hope and the grace that is offered to us through God, through the Holy Spirit that inhabits us. These are all parts of the grand design of creation. Yes, pain and suffering exists, but so does love, and so does hope. And those are the things to hold on to. It's incredible to read what C.S. Lewis has to say. And whether you realize it or not, you think of C.S. Lewis as an intellectual person, which he was, and a lot of his writing, showcases that. But also his writings show his understanding of pain and suffering and his ability to still see the good in everything and the love of Jesus despite the pain and suffering. And if you observe closely to all of his writings, you see that. You can see it in some of his fiction writings, and you can read about it in some of his nonfiction writings, like The Problem of Pain and the Grief Observed. Now, I don't want to say much more because I really want you to have the opportunity to read those books and listen to this podcast, the C.S. Lewis podcast, episode 8, featuring Alistair McGrath. I want you to hear it from their perspectives, what the problem of pain and suffering is, and understanding how we can take both the intellectual answers and the emotional answers together, that they both serve an important purpose, and fundamentally, we need both of them to understand life. We have to understand everything from an intellectual perspective, a physical perspective, and a mental and emotional perspective, because that's what life is. That's what God's creation is. It's all of those combined. And C.S. Lewis does a great job of showcasing that when you combined his writings. And that's what makes him such an influential Christian thinker even today. That's why we still continue to read his books. That's why his writings still influence us today. And when we're talking about today, when we're talking about the issues that we talked about last month, that we are going on right now, we can still have hope despite all of those issues. And we can read about why we have that hope through and from C.S. Lewis. Well, that's really all I have for you guys today. I'm thankful that you guys were able to, tune in to today's episode. Like I mentioned, read The Problem of Pain, read A Grief Observed, and listen to the Alistair McGrath C.S. Lewis podcast, episode 8, that you can find on Spotify, so that you can get a better understanding of C.S. Lewis and how we can use his writings, his teachings, to help us bridge gaps today. We'll be back next month with a brand new topic over a brand new person, which I'm super excited about because we are going to be heading to one of the earliest of the Nazarene theologians and ministers, who just so happens to be an influential female theologian for us to be inspired by and influenced by. Next month, we're going to start a topic on Phoebe Palmer, who was a early Nazarene, and I'm super excited about that. So make sure you tune back in next month as we talk about Phoebe Palmer. Until then, bye.